Hello, welcome to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson. I am, as always, with Pete Lee. And we've just put out an episode in which we gave a quick rundown of the remaining candidates in the Chilean presidential race, which is going to be decided on, voted on very soon.
Yeah, in a week.
In a week. And this is a companion piece in which we're going to, well, Pete, tell us what we're going to do in this episode.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the way that Chilean politics, Chilean state, the Chilean nation, the way it's perceived by other South American countries in general, according to their political traditions and settings.
Okay, and how the Chilean election might tie in with what's happening politically in other Latin South American countries too. Now, I think the first thing to say is that there is an image of Chile, which is very widespread, held both in English-speaking countries and in Latin America itself, as being something of a success story since the end of the dictatorship, with quite good economic growth, a country that's kind of more or less decoupled from the continent and not wanted to get too embroiled in the kind of customs unions and sort of, you know, tariff barriers of Mercosur, for example, but it's gone its own way with a neoliberal economic model introduced by Pinochet, who started off by flirting with syndicalism, that kind of, you know, sort of early form of fascism, if you like, or but then went the other way, the neoliberal route of free markets, low tariffs, very little state protection, private pensions. Inspired by the Chicago boys who came back, these Chileans who studied at the University of Chicago, were very influenced by Milton Friedman and brought back his model, his free market model. And that was applied in Chile, you know, pretty thoroughly, and became a model in turn for Margaret Thatcher and others. So it was very influential. And so there is a general image of Chile of this being the character of the country, that it's a neoliberal country. Now, I would like to read you a somewhat long quote, but I think it's worth it, from a book called Carta Abierta Agustín Edwards, meaning open letter to Agustín Edwards. He was the owner and editor of the main conservative paper that supported the dictatorship. This book was written in 2002. And in fact, Pete, it's stayed in the family, hasn't it?
Yes.
The Mercurio, that's right.
Yes, I believe that the main owner was until recently always called Agustín Edwards. This one was Agustín Edwards Eastman, and I think he's from the same line as the Kodak family in some indirect sort of way. Mm-hmm. And Agustín Edwards sort of regenerates like Doctor Who every generation. And
that's right. That's right. It's a big analogy. And the newspaper has modernized, you know. You wouldn't, but you know, there is definitely still a kind of, you know, something pretty right wing is still there in its DNA, isn't it? Even though you wouldn't necessarily think so as you flick through it. And it's the same group that owns a number of other papers, including the one I write for, as we said, Las Últimas Noticias. So faint echoes of this DNA occasionally reach us, those of us who write for it. If DNA can have echoes, I'm rambling. Anyway, well, so Uribe was not a fan. Was not a fan of Agustín Edwards and of the Mercurio, which he regarded as simply actually as basically a CIA front, you know, which actually kind of, to be honest, it pretty much was, because it was funded by the CIA. Now, Uribe was a poet. He was also Chilean ambassador. He wasn't ambassador in Washington, but he was the political director or something very high up. He studied very closely American policy towards Latin American Chile. He was a lawyer. He then became ambassador to China, and the coup found him in China. So he didn't go back to Chile. He went into exile in France. Now, he was a very forthright person. He was quite a celebrity, actually. Journalists would seek him out in his old age. He locked himself in his flat after the death of a son. I won't go on too long, but he's a very interesting character. He was a very interesting character. Sussed himself well as flat, but he did receive journalists and issued very forthright opinions about Chilean democracy being a complete sham was one of his big themes. He's very worth reading on the subject. But this quote is about the Chilean character, and it's an aside in this book about the Mercurio and Agustin Edwards. And I'll just read it out in translation, in my translation. In Spain, says Uribe, the centuries-long conflict with the Moors ended in the very year of the discovery of America, obviously in 1492, when the last Muslims, rulers were defeated in Iberia. More than in any region in this fifth of the world, its spirit, the spirit of this conflict, and the experience of warlike acts were perpetuated in Chile in the long struggle this is to subjugate the Mapuches, who weren't really defeated for centuries. One has the impression, says Uribe, that a kind of medieval, miscellaneous style lingers in the Chilean collective unconscious. Notes of brutality, solidarity, group loyalties, and contempt or mistrust of outsiders, all upholding the notion of what is legal and lawful. There is the oral persistence of Spanish popular tradition, supplemented by traditions and customs of the indigenous peoples and their mestizos in odd and sometimes potent hybrids. And here's like the crucial part, about the kind of neoliberal model, okay? No hint of capitalist reformed Christianity, neither work ethic nor appetite to consume beyond the needs of subsistence and the occasional bout of excess. Idleness and pride felt as virtues, fleeting in effort, desperately tenacious if that effort has to last, capable of accommodation without true acceptance, swift to imitate, if ineluctable real conditions thwart one or many of these innate characteristics, retaining a keen desire to live by them, though hardly daring hope this might come about. The Catholic, not always Christian, religious spirit of the Council of Trent, indulging syncretic forms of popular religiosity. Okay, now that's a pretty long quote, but he's saying, in essence, that the neoliberal model is completely opposed to the Chilean character. That there was never a Protestant work ethic, that all of this stuff is not actually for Chileans. And once the Chileans have the chance, they will throw it off. So back to the present day, what do you think, Pete?
Yes, well, I mean, there are opposing opinions on that as well. For example, the great historian Encina noted that outside Santiago, in the ports, there was something like a Protestant ethic developed by the often literally Protestant immigrant groups, and that pattern is seen to this day. Claudio Vélez is an economic historian as well, who has explored the analogy between Englishness and Chileanness, which is quite interesting. But Chile does have this reputation for being the neoliberal quintessence of Latin Americanness, I guess. And of the little that other Latin Americans will know about Chile, that's part of the stereotype, an important part of the stereotype. They're also often quite jealous that Chile's managed to organise itself since the late 80s better in some ways.
That's right. Chile, has rather turned its back on the continent. Chile is an associate member of Mercosur, so it allows the kind of pretty much free movement of people within Mercosur, but it's politely declined to take part in the customs union. Chile is a free market, low tariffs. So this behaviour is just ever so slightly offensive, possibly, to Chile's Latin American brothers.
It could be. It could be, but there are more offensive countries, I think, for much of the place than Chile. For example, those that are under essentially populist military rule, such as Venezuela, Cuba, and now Nicaragua, which just had a sham election. We mentioned it in our companion piece video. And it is interesting to see which Latin American leaders congratulate a president who's just won a sham election in somewhere like Venezuela or Nicaragua.
So who are the usual suspects? Who supports Venezuelan, the Venezuelan government, the Cuban government, Ortega in Latin America?
Well, certainly the left wing of Peronism in Argentina, which is led by Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, loves him. Alberto Fernandez, who's sort of her puppet, a little bit more to the right of her, was obliged to congratulate Ortega. Of course, Nicolas Maduro loves it, and so on. So some of the more left-leaning Bolivarian leaders approve of it, and obviously the majority of Chileans don't like dictatorships in general, but even those who approved of the Chilean dictatorship in the 70s and 80s really despise populist left-wing dictators.
Right, this is the wrong type of dictatorship, isn't it? I mean, because in Latin America generally, the kind of love of democracy has been waning a lot, hasn't it? You know, there's this Latino Barometro poll, which is taken, I think, annually, on precisely attitudes towards these subjects, and it shows, I think, support for democracy is really barely over 50% now in Latin America, and in some countries it's lower, which seems fairly foolish, really, because I don't see why, even if you don't like your democracy, it's difficult to imagine an alternative would be much better. There it is.
Even a manufactured consent is better than no consent at all.
That's right. That's right. And so yeah, well, there's been this election in Nicaragua, which, as we mentioned, was warmly approved of by the Communist Party in Chile, but repudiated by Gabriel Boric, the contender for the presidency, and actually did split the Communist Party in Chile between its older and younger members, broadly speaking, the kind of those with more of a kind of nostalgia for Stalinism, as opposed to those who sort of were, you know, slightly more hip, I suppose, whatever the word is. That's right. Yeah. So anyway, so the left-wing populism continues in Latin America.
Yeah, and understanding what's going on in Chile from other parts of Latin America is probably an interesting exercise. I don't know whether anyone goes into great detail about their neighbours in Latin American countries. They are very Republican orientations. They do take their nation state very seriously, even though none of them collect enough taxes to do much at the state level. But I think if we go around the grounds of South America, at least, and by South America, I mean the members of the CONMEBOL Football Federation. There are 10 members, of which Chile is one. If we look at the other 9 and we ignore Suriname and Guyana and French Guiana and the part of Panama to the south of the canal, I think we can get an idea of what's happening in those countries very shallowly and how it might relate with some redolence with respect to Chile, and maybe some hints of trends, tides, and so forth.
Okay, good. So what do you think? I mean, there's talk of the kind of marea roja, the red tide, the kind of drift. What do you think of that?
Pinkish tide, yes. Since the late 90s, really, with the rise of Chavez in Venezuela, and we should probably finish with Venezuela in our talk. There are different, very differently nationally patterned forms of a kind of left-leaning aesthetic that emerged after it was realised that the Cold War had ended towards the end of the 1990s. We were pretty sure that the Cold War had ended at that point, and we see different variants of slightly more left-leaning politics. I think we can go around the grounds starting in Brazil and get to Venezuela, and we can probably say something about each country and Chile. In Brazil at the moment, of course, we have the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, who's been in since, the very start of 2019, elected in 2018. He's a kind of right-wing populist often compared to Trump or even to Putin. He's an action man, a former paratrooper, famously bad at handling COVID, got COVID, just a character. He's from Rio de Janeiro. Obviously, Brazil is a very, very complex country with well over 200 million people, 212, 220, we don't know how many people. Very, very complicated place. It's interesting for Chile because some people want to describe one of the leading candidates as a kind of Chilean Bolsonaro, Juan Antonio
Cast,
who's running a kind of right-wing populist, perhaps far-right position, but is moving more towards the centre, since nature hates a vacuum, all the votes are in the centre, and the candidates who more naturally would represent the centre have performed very badly. So he's looking less and less like a Chilean Bolsonaro at this point. But if he does get in, he'll have to be a bit like Bolsonaro and use the force of will or whatever he can do. I don't think he'll be allowed to do rule by decree, but he'll somehow have to charge a very hostile Congress and Senate.
And very likely quite a lot of violence on the streets.
Yes, he'll have to somehow find a way to horse whisper some kind of governability into the country. He seems reasonably charming to me. Maybe he can do it, but he is a hate figure, Cast, not as much as Bolsonaro, but I can see the analogy. I can see the analogy there.
Yeah, there's a thing of aesthetic in common, isn't there? Yeah, so well, that's right. So Brazil. Well, so I'm just reading some letters of Lawrence Durrell, who he spent a year in Argentina, in Cordoba, in the 1950s, late 1950s, and it reminded me that when he passed through Rio de Janeiro, he was just astonished. At that moment, Brazil, at least a couple of Brazilian cities, particularly Rio, was about the most modern place on earth. He said that compared to Rio, New York looked old-fashioned, extraordinary countries. And of course, that's gone. Nobody would say such a thing now. I mean, all of Latin America has really slipped backwards,
yes,
badly, hasn't it, in the last 100 years or so?
I don't know if we said it in Chile talk before, but of course, Charles de Gaulle, passing through, famously said that Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be.
De Gaulle was a pretty good prophet, actually. He might also be grouped with the Bolsonaro sort of figures of this
yes.
world, but he was a pretty good prophet, and actually quite a wit as well, which always helps. Yes. Yeah, that's right. And sorry, just to sort of go off on the literary sort of reminiscence here a bit. There's a very good poem by Sylvia Plath called Brasilia. And it starts in it, will they occur? Well, I won't quote the poem, but what it is this was when Brasilia was being built in the 1960s. And again, this was just the last word of modernity. People were just astonished at these pictures coming out of the jungle, of this hyper-modern metropolis just being built in the jungle. That was the future. I mean, and she imagined the place being peopled with kind of robots and stuff. Brazil was just the most modern place on earth in the 50s and 60s. And what happened? But it's very interesting to trace this secular decline of Latin America, and it's easy to forget now, that it was that. So these were some of the richest countries of the world in the 1920s, the most modern in the 1950s and 60s. Still, in my lifetime, I guess I'm showing my age. But anyway, there's an interesting aside. So,
yes,
it does sort of feel that Latin American countries, you read the words of the national anthems of Latin American countries. These were going to be, great countries. They were going to kind of knock Europe into a cocked hat, and probably the States as well. And now they're kind of basically just struggling to hold on a lot of the time, aren't they? And kind of keep the show on the road.
Yes.
And
yes, that's the case for most of these countries. I mean, Brazil is so complex, and of course, Bolsonaro came in elected after a previous right-wing government that had been installed essentially through a judicial coup against left-wing populist working party organization, which is very corrupt, as are all the other parts of Brazilian politics and most of Latin American politics. But it looks like the Workers' Party head honcho Lula might come back and knock Bolsonaro off in the next election. Might be next year, the end of next year. So we'll have to see.
So it makes no sense to talk about a red tide or indeed a right wing. I mean, it just goes back and forth, doesn't it? Basically.
Yeah.
But I guess, but there is a more populist thing. The swings are perhaps, we could say the swings are a bit more extreme. That the candidates, certainly in Chile, the center candidates have been kind of Provoste, and Sichel look like they're going down, due mainly to unforced errors of their own. But I guess if that happens enough, it can look like a trend, can't it? So we've got, two relatively extreme candidates probably going to come through in Chile. We have, Bolsonaro against Lula in Brazil. We have the eternal Peronists in Argentina. So the center ground is kind of proving kind of elusive, isn't it?
Yes, it's difficult. I mean, we must move on from Brazil and we'll look at some smaller countries that are interesting in their own right. Paraguay is a good one. It's got under 12 million people. Very interesting country. Very strong Guarani indigenous culture.
The only country in the Americas where the indigenous language holds equal status with the colonial language.
Yes,
remarkable country.
A country that was almost wiped out by its neighbours in the 1870s, around then anyway. Wonderful culture in many ways. Its current president is its current president is Marito Abdo, who's from the Colorado, which the Colorado parties are usually these sort of traditional conservative parties. It's been around forever, since the 19th century. And he's a kind of neoliberal from a wealthy background, a wealthy Syrian or Lebanese descent. He's youngish, been in since 2018. They have a toxic kind of politics, always ugly handovers between the rulers. He's just running it along, as neoliberal as he can possibly manage.
That's right. But within this, there's a certain continuity. You mentioned the Colorado Party has been going forever, and they backed Stroessner, didn't they? The Paraguayan dictator back in the day. So,
yes.
So there's an element of continuity running through all these dramatic all these changes and these kind of ugly transitions.
He was a real marathon dictator, Stroessner. He really knew what he was doing.
So sorry, yes. So which way are things going in Paraguay? Sorry, I sort of interrupted you.
Oh well, we don't know. I mean, he seems to be quite disastrous, Abdo. So it's basically inscrutable from a Chilean point of view, and I imagine they find Chile inscrutable as well. Moving on to Uruguay, which has perhaps 3.5 million people. At the moment, they've got a centre-right candidate. In such a small country, any neoliberalism is much more boutique, I guess. Luis Lacalle Pou, and simply by being next to Argentina and to a lesser extent Brazil, it's always possible to see what not to do in terms of running a small little country. And Uruguay seems to do well. Of course, they got a lot of very good press under their former guerrilla president from the left-wing coalition, which was called Frente Amplio, and of course, where the name of the Chilean party group comes from. José Mujica, he was an octogenarian. I think he was in for 8 years last decade. He was very popular, legalized cannabis and various other things.
That's right. I mean, he was, I suppose we have to say, you could call him a terrorist, but he was a pretty affable character, wasn't he? And yes, much loved and sort of grand elder statesman and sort of all that kind of stuff. Yeah, interesting case.
Yeah, he seemed very wise and not petulant. So Uruguay seems to be kicking along quite well as a city-state. And then we've got a country that's having an election today. Argentina is having its midterms today, and it looks like the Peronists And of course, the Peronists have at least two major wings, the left and the right. The Peronists are going to lose some representatives in the Congress. The Congress is headed by the son of the vice president. And it looks like he's not going to do very well. And the other side, which tries to be neoliberal, but can't really do it. In the last term, Mauricio Macri brought in International Monetary Fund monies that are causing problems.
Yes, that's right. He was pretty spectacularly unsuccessful, wasn't he, as president? I'm not quite sure why. I've never really looked into it, whether it's just the country, just the finances were just too bad to start with, or whether he messed it all up, or whether the Argentina's just like got the wrong climate for neoliberalism or something, you know, like something to do with the weather. Lawrence says here, the earth speaks here and says ugly, swinish things, you know, but possibly it's just not the right sort of, there's just something in nature itself in Argentina, you know, that doesn't allow neoliberalism to take place, you know.
Yeah, Argentina does have a very early experimental, not even experimental, full democratic tradition from the really, well, 1912 it was legislated. So since 1916, there has been universal manhood suffrage anyway. Of course, with a lot of dictatorships since 1930 as well. And partly because I guess Perón was such a towering figure, such a towering personality, towering nationalist, well beyond his death, almost 50 years beyond his death, he's still the most important politician in Argentina. And Chile has no parallel whatsoever to Peronism. Peronism is an extraordinary thing.
That's right. I mean, yeah, absolutely. You know, Spengler says somewhere that, you know, the countries that will survive in future, in the general collapse of everything, you know, are the ones that have like hang on to their own things, whatever those own things might be. So I think Argentina is going to be one of them, because they really hang on to Peronism, you know, and it just never seems to wane at all.
Well, I mean, the official name of Peronism is, of course, justicialism. It's not for labor, it's not socialistic, it's not for capital, it's not capitalistic, it's for justice. And to be able to say that with a straight face, you have to be a genius, and Perón did. And
absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And as a spectacle, it's simply admirable, you know.
Yes.
In terms economically, yes. Anyway, well, anyway, okay. Let's move on. So let's continue this whip round of different countries.
Yeah,
so
it really has nothing to do with Chile. Argentina has very little to do with Chile. There can be little application of the political principles that are functioning in Argentina, in different parts of Argentina, functioning in Chile. It's not possible. I read in a roundup in one of the newspapers, an Argentinian journalist described what's happening in Chile as a possible Peronization. Not Peronization, I meant to say Peruvianization. Turning into Peru, yes. Which is interesting, because Argentina came up with this concept of Latin Americanization, was the thing that they were most afraid of during the Great Depression when they had their first dictatorship. Chile eventually adopted the term Latin Americanization, becoming too much like Latin America, becoming too tropical. And then we're even starting to say Argentinization as well, becoming too much like Argentina when things get dysfunctional here. But in the Argentine case, their understanding of Chile is at an arm's length. I mean, they don't take Chile particularly seriously as a model because simply too different a place. But before we get to Peru, we should look at an interesting country that has good relations with Argentina, or at least the Argentinian government, which is Bolivia. And Bolivia, of course, traditionally has very bad relations with Chile, not least because Chile nicked its coastline in 1879.
That's right, this unending border dispute, yeah.
Yes, and the current president is Luis Arce, who is from the same party as Evo Morales, who is basically world famous as a kind of ex-coca leaf growing Aymara indigenous leader, very charismatic. Did, I think, quite good work in terms of the self-esteem of Bolivians, creating a sense of a country which they call a plurinational state.
Bolivia. And also, I think, with primary education and stuff, I think he's done quite good work. And then there's this concept of the buen vivir, of like living well, he's promoted, hasn't he?
Yeah.
And it's to some extent caught on, at least with international organizations, which kind of quite enjoy the concept, like the UN.
Yeah.
At a popular level elsewhere, I'm not sure it's caught on, but it's like the idea that there's more to life. Obviously, it's the old thing, there's more to life than money. And we haven't got much money, but we know something about living well, which you people don't know with your endless money grubbing, which is a perfectly good point. So, whether they could probably do with a bit more money too, but absolutely, why not?
Yes, yeah, and of course Evo was deposed after trying to make himself a lifelong leader or something like that.
Unfortunately, Latin American things do have a way of, like, all these wonderful things have a way of degenerating into somebody trying to become kind of president for life, don't they?
Yes, but to his credit, he hasn't even seemed to try to have come back as president. And Luis Arce, who is the president, is quite different. He's a sort of managerial figure. He's taking the principles of the movement towards socialism, Evo's movement, and he's kind of in a consolidating phase, which is probably quite wise, especially with all the geopolitical shenanigans at the moment, relations between China and the US and so on. Arce is a bit of a surprise packet. He's interesting figure. Bolivia does not have diplomatic relations with Chile. Very different places. There's always talk of restarting those diplomatic relations. They were broken off in the 70s when all the neighbors were ganging up on Chile because Chile was losing the support of US opinion, basically. And
that's it. Bolivia would love to get their coastline back. They've taken it to The Hague, where I think it's still dragging on. They're not going to invade because Chile's got a ton of like ultra modern fighter jets, sitting in Arica or whatever, and facing 3 or 4 biplanes, I think, which is Bolivia's Air Force. So yeah, this thing just drags on and on, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think from a Chilean point of view, there is a certain admiration for what's happened in Bolivia over the last 20 years or so. I think most people can recognize that what Evo Morales started suits Bolivia. Now, whether Chile should become a plurinational state does seem like a bit of a stretch.
Which has been proposed in the Constitutional Convention, hasn't it? By the chairwoman, whose name you will now remind me of.
The President, Elisa Loncon.
Elisa Loncon, who's Mapuche, and she's talked about Chile being a plurinational state. The trouble is that Bolivia does have a really large indigenous population. Chile's got a small one.
Who speak their indigenous languages and pursue their indigenous cultures.
Whereas the Mapuche, though there is a strong nationalist movement, but the language is dying out very quickly. Young people speaking it, it really is just, in this generation, it's just like going. So it's just very questionable whether there's a basis for that, And at the very most, it would be like England and Wales. That would be the kind of relationship of sort of population, wouldn't it, roughly? I suppose that's enough to make a plurinational state. The United Kingdom is a kind of plurinational state. But you can see why, these sort of Mapuche militants in the south of Chile are stepping up their activities. And now, of course, the government's obviously responding in kind, state of emergency, army being brought in. It seems to be going the way of Northern Ireland, really. One would expect it to turn at some point to real terrorism,
Yeah, I hope not.
But you can see why they're getting a bit desperate, because their cultural position's eroding. You know, people just don't want to speak the language and stuff. You know.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's a funny, because they've almost had this plurinational concept projected upon themselves, or some sort of I guess policy entrepreneurs have projected it upon them, and it may not be the correct fit, the correct analogy.
Anyway, sorry, that was I took us down this side path of the Mapuche.
Yes.
So that's Bolivia. You know, they've got some successes to their name.
A very complex little country. Whereas Chile, you know, has a strong centralist tradition that we're also trying to water down a bit, or work out some other way to do something else, which is interesting. Peru is a country, I mean, much like Brazil, I'm not sure it's a country. It's probably 5 countries. And at the moment, as of this year, in the middle of this year, in an extremely interesting election, we had the election of Pedro Castillo, who is a school teacher from the countryside. His parents were proper campesinos, and he comes from the Cajamarca district, which is where Atahualpa was apprehended and defeated. The Inca Empire fell apart, and in a field of 1 million candidates, he managed to beat Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of the former authoritarian leader, Alberto Fujimori, who stole a lot of money in the 1990s. He managed to beat her just on a knife's edge, with a lot of intrigue in the election. And since being elected, since he has very few aligned party members in the Congress, he's really struggled to form a government. He's been through a couple of interior ministers and other important posts. He's actually lost his main coalition, Peru Libre, and it's a real mess. It's a real mess. Peru is a complex country, and it's very difficult to see how you can run a liberal democracy there at all.
Let alone a successful one.
Yes. Part of Castillo's thing is he's not from Lima, which is a big fractious issue. There's a bit of that in Chile as well, you know. But I think it's a bit more benign in Chile, partly because Santiago itself is such a sleepy capital. For a city with 7 million people, I don't think, you know, it's not what you'd expect of a 7 million person city. So Chilean regionalism is more about what can we get, how can we set up our local mafia and get some more powers. That's the great fear. But it's nothing like the complexity of somewhere like Peru, which only has around twice as many people as Chile, but is 1 million times more complicated. Politically.
Okay, and where else? We should probably start thinking about wrapping up now, so there's not too.
Yeah, well, we've got to get through 3 more countries first.
Okay.
Starting with
Okay.
Ecuador. Ecuador is another plurinational country. It's actually quite similar to Chile in strange ways. It's got a similar population. It's got about 16 or 17 million people.
Sorry. I just missed which country you were talking about.
Ecuador.
Ecuador, of course.
Ecuador. So Ecuador's got a similar population, 16, 17 million people, as opposed to 19 million in Chile. A big difference is that it does have 2 parts. It has the coast, with Guayaquil, effectively the main metropolis, and the mountains, the Sierra, with Quito as the capital. So there's a bit of a split there. At the moment, it has a right-leaning former banker ruling, who was elected this year, much to the surprise of everyone. The former left-leaning coalition, which was part of the pink tide, the Marea Rosa, did not obtain its candidate as the selected president. that actually has that movement that the previous president came from has two sort of personality cults as well. The previous quite young president, Rafael Correa, was kind of more left-leaning, but he was also quite clearly very corrupt. And Lenin Moreno, somewhat corrupt, but more centrist, accused of being neoliberal. This new guy, certainly accused of being neoliberal. They've got problems with narcos, with drug cartels. The prisons are seeing huge riots and lots of problems. Lots of Venezuelan refugees, essentially, in Ecuador.
That's right. That's right. There was a huge prison riot, wasn't there, just now, that killed 68 people died or something?
Yes.
I forget the exact figure. Yeah. Well, it's shudders to think what an Ecuadorian jail is like.
Yeah, it's out of control. It's quite scary. So that's Ecuador. There are some points that is another point similar to Chile is actually in Ecuador they have the same civil code essentially as Chile from Andres Bello. They adopted and kept his civil code and much of the Chilean style institutionality that was reasonably successful in the 19th century anyway. So there are some similarities. Not sharing a border with Chile obviously makes them more affectionate towards the Chileans than other countries. But Ecuador's got some problems at the moment politically as well. And it's interesting that they managed to get a sort of standard neoliberal former banker in as president. And we'll have to see how he goes with his next 3 years. It's not looking good so far.
Okay.
Right. And then we've got Colombia. Now, Colombia is the scene of the crime for Sebastián Piñera in his second government. Sebastián Piñera flew fairly early in his second government to the border with Venezuela to a kind of ceremony mocking Venezuela as a great international statesman in Cúcuta, is the name of the border town between Colombia and Venezuela, with Iván Duque, who's the right-leaning neoliberal president who's extremely unpopular at the moment and has faced kind of similar rioting and problems as Chile has faced. And it was after doing this that things really started to go wrong for Chile in 2019. Of course, culminating in the October of that year with the so-called Estallido Social.
So there's probably no direct cause and effect. It's somehow making these big statesman-like stands. It does tend to be followed by some kind of like farcical humiliation, doesn't it? It's tempting phase, isn't it?
Pride before the fall, which leads to a lot of combination of conspiracy theories and sort of regretting not having decent sort of military or police intelligence about whether, some of the Venezuelan agents provocateurs were somehow involved in exacerbating Chile's problems during the Estallido Social. Of course, virtually all of the Venezuelans in Chile are extremely anti the Maduro government in Venezuela. But just to finish with Colombia, Duque is extremely unsuccessful. He's going to be knocked out. And for the first time, it would seem that Colombia is going to elect a left-leaning government. So that will be an experimental experience, not unlike what an Apruebo Dignidad, that is Boric government, would be, with Boric, with his communist allies and the student movement, Frente Amplio, ruling the place. It would be very experimental. And in some people's minds, it recalls the experimental experience of Salvador Allende, who had so many problems with.
That's right. Very interesting, because at the moment there's been this kind of division, which is the countries on the Pacific coast of South America have been more liberal economically, right? They belong to the Pacific Alliance. There's this clear division, right? And then the ones down the right-hand side, down the Atlantic coast, are more aligned as well. This kind of sympathy between Argentina, Venezuela, all that kind of stuff. But that could just collapse pretty overnight, couldn't it? If Colombia and Chile both go both go left.
Yes, at least the reports that we get from Chile make it seem that it's very likely that some kind of left-wing coalition will come in odds-on favourite, which is not quite the case in Chile. In Chile, it's still a bit of a coin toss. And also in Chile, it's quite clear that whoever is the government is going to really struggle to run a program through the Congress anyway. So,
right.
A nice thing about Chile is I'm pretty sure that any kind of military intervention is well and truly off the cards. I think I could see a military intervention in the Mapuche territorial claims, but I couldn't see a general coup because the military will not be hung out to dry like they were by the politicians after the military government last time around. The politicians, of course, being the generals. The lower down generals will not be hung out to dry, and they don't have the resources, I think, to do that.
It would be very imprudent, wouldn't it? Okay,
so that's Colombia. We're up to Venezuela to finish. And of course, Venezuela has a military government, essentially a populist military government, where the only way to survive is to have connections with the state. Apparently they have about 600,000 people working for the state, and they have access to food and.
I see. I was going to comment. It's amazing, how a country can completely collapse, as Venezuela seemed to do, and then continue going in that state of complete collapse for a very long time. It's interesting that, and kind of bump along,
It seems to have lost 6 million people at least.
Yes, that's
down to 28 million or something like that, according to the figures we've seen. It's pretty sad. A lot of malnutrition, a lot of suffering, and
no medicines in the hospital, whatever, in the hospitals.
The army's in control. Of course, Chavez was elected, who preceded Maduro. He was elected in 1998 after attempting a sort of military intrigue earlier in the 90s, and was very popular, had a lot of petrol money to spend on popular programs, but the country has collapsed.
That's right, and launched this Pedro Caribe, is it called? This program of giving oil money to these other countries and becoming a regional power. And then, of course, doing what a lot of, strongmen like to do, which is to appoint a thoroughly mediocre successor so that they themselves will live on in the popular memory as this great figure compared to this, bus driver. In fact,
yes, Maduro, former bus driver, seems mediocre, but you just wouldn't know. I mean, everything he says seems kind of stupid, but maybe he's not in charge, maybe someone else is. Who knows?
That's right. Who knows? Excellent roundup of continental, subcontinental politics. Just perhaps on the final note, you mentioned this Latin Americanization or Argentinianization or Peruvianization in Chile. An Argentinian I know was, talking about opening an account abroad and maybe a bank account in Chile. And I said, oh, well, this is a little while ago, actually. And I said, you could open an account in dollars, or you could open an account in Chilean pesos. It was a very stable currency, respectable. They launch, you have international bond issues, proper currency. And she said, I'm not opening an account in any currency called the peso. Sorry, she had no faith in this at all. and possibly, certainly recent events do seem to have borne out her instinctive skepticism, because the Chilean peso has lost a lot of value against the dollar and other currencies.
Not quite as bad as the Argentinian peso.
No.
But yes, it's probably is a wise rule of thumb, at least to have some account in some other currency other than
it's not called the peso.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, on that note, I guess we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you very much again for joining us, and hope to see you here again soon on Chile Talk.
Thanks very much. Thank you.